Hello and welcome back to another episode of the Bible in 1 Year with the Preacher's Husband. Today we're going through 2 Samuel chapter 13 through 15. And today is Storytelling Day. So get ready for some stories. Tomorrow we're going to be in Psalm 3, 4, 12, 13, 28, and 55. So, spoiler alert, to get the conclusion of today's stories, you're going to have to wait 2 days to hear the rest of the story. So, let's get started because there's a whole lot to it. Chapter 13. Some time had passed, and David's son Absalom had a beautiful sister named Tamar, and David's son Amnon was infatuated with her. Now, this word infatuated, it could, in some translations it says loved, but in others it says infatuated. And infatuated may be a better translation here, since later on we find out that he never really loved her. He only was infatuated with her. So David had several wives. So here's the story. And he fathered many children by these wives. Both Absalom and Tamar had Maacah as their mother, whereas Amnon, David's firstborn son, had Ahinoam as his mother. So that basically meant that Tamar was his half-sister. Not a sister, but half-sister. Doesn't make it any better. The words was infatuated with, as we said, probably just meant infatuated and not really loved. It can be translated into loved, but we find out that he never really did. Amnon was frustrated because he wanted Tamar for his wife, but he couldn't marry his half-sister. We read about that in Leviticus chapter 18 verse 11 and chapter 20 verse 17. It was against the rules. So he concocted this scheme to find a way to get her alone. And it works. 3 times once Tamar was with him, she urged her brother not to violate her. Doing such a thing was a serious offense in the law of Moses that we read about in Deuteronomy chapter 22, verse 25 through 29. Now, Tamar also insisted that the crime would shame both her and her brother, and she suggested that Amnon speak to the king about marrying her first. Well, we just said that was against the rules to begin with. It was against their religion in Leviticus, as it said in Leviticus. It was against those Levitical laws. But this may have been a means for her to try to escape the situation. It's unlikely that David would have ever granted Amnon's request in violation of those Mosaic laws. Those were the ones we talked about in Leviticus chapter 18 verse 11 and chapter 20 verse 17. Now the words Amnon hated Tamar show that his feelings towards her after he raped her, it had been nothing more than lust. There was no love there. It wasn't love. It was just lust. And then he attempted to send Tamar away afterwards, after that assault had happened and that rape. But she basically said that was a worse punishment than the rape itself, because this was going to ensure that her shame was going to become permanent. So Absalom found Tamar and discovered Amnon had raped her. So he tells her to be quiet for now. Probably meant that Absalom wanted Tamar to refrain from revealing what had happened until he could think of a way to help her or to take vengeance on Amnon. Now, as a desolate woman, as it says here, Tamar's probably not ever going to marry. However, Absalom cared for her in his house, and he took her under his wing. So David finds out about this, and guess what? David is actually furious. But what did he do? He did nothing. He did absolutely nothing. Now, Absalom, Tamar's full brother, did not say anything to Amnon, either good or bad, and he chose instead to wait for his opportunity for revenge, which will come later. 2 years later, actually, was a long time, but Absalom had not forgotten about Amnon's sin. Sheep shearing was a time of celebration, and they were going to have this sheep shearing celebration. So Absalom invited all the king's sons to Baal Hazor, which was about 14 or 15 miles north of Jerusalem. Absalom commanded his young men to strike Amnon. And of course, he commissioned his hitmen with the words similar to those that God spoke to Joshua in Joshua chapter 1 verse 9. And attack they did. They did the deed. So Absalom's young men did to Amnon just as Absalom had commanded. And all the rest of the king's sons, they were all right there when it happened. So they all fled on their mules. They ran off. And a report got to David saying that Absalom had killed all of his sons. Not even one of them survived. But Jonadab, who was the son of David's brother, spoke up and said, "My lord, don't think that they have killed all of these young men, the king's of all of your sons, because only Amnon is dead." In fact, Absalom had planned this ever since the day Amnon disgraced his sister Tamar. Only Amnon is dead. Meanwhile, Absalom had fled. He had run. And he stayed gone for 3 years. He went to Talmai, which was his grandfather, his maternal grandfather, and he went to Geshur to see him. Now, David and Talmai were on friendly terms, so it would be very difficult for David to insist on returning Absalom to him. So Absalom stayed there for 3 years in Geshur. Now, David missed Absalom, and he finished grieving over Amnon's death, and then he felt terrible for missing his son Absalom. Yet he did not arrange for Absalom's homecoming. David's inaction would instead lead to even further troubles as we move on through the story. Joab thought that Tekoa was far enough away that David wouldn't recognize someone from there. So what he did is he put this plot together, and he intended for a wise woman to play a dramatic role that would influence the king to bring Absalom back to Jerusalem. The clever woman here tells a story that's similar to the Cain and Abel story in Genesis chapter 4, verses 8 through 16. Now, the woman's clan was attempting to execute and put her living son to death. The reason why is because he killed his brother. So they were going to put him to death, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, But in doing so, that would eliminate her only heir, and that's the heir to her estate, and her husband's family name would come to an end if they killed him, because all she had was the 2 boys. So she tells his story, and David assures the woman that he would issue a command to protect the living son. And the woman suggested that she had put David in a very difficult position to let the murderer go free. And isn't that a pretty difficult position, right? To let a murderer go free. All for the sake of a name. Well, David vowed to her anyway that everything's going to be okay, and that yes, that's what he was going to do. Well, the woman had received her judgment, but she broke protocol, and she questioned a chance. She requested a chance to speak further with King David, and David granted her that request. And when she got in front of him, she basically said, "The king has pronounced his own guilt." That's implied that David was unwilling to give himself the same judgment he gave the woman. He was unwilling to restore Absalom, who had murdered Amnon. So basically, Turner is saying that, you're going to give me this opportunity to restore my son, who wasn't even real, but you won't do that for yourself. And her blessing at the end here was interesting. It says, "May the Lord your God be with you." This may have hinted that just as the king could discern the good and the bad for others, perhaps with God's help he could discern for himself the wisest thing to do about Absalom. Now, David was indeed discerning, and he was a very smart man. He actually suspected that the royal family had put this lady up to this. He was not really completely fooled by this ruse that Joab had put together. So eventually the woman confessed and said, "Yeah, Joab used me," and David saw through it. So he asked his nephew to bring Absalom. After he thought about it, and Joab appeared pleased to have played a part in beginning the reconciliation process between David and Absalom. Ironically, David gave Absalom permission to return to his house, but he would not give Absalom an audience right away. David's halfway decision here really had only inflamed the situation and made the tensions worse. Absalom had a daughter named Tamar. This was his way of honoring his sister. That was in chapter 14, verse 27. Now, both David and Absalom lived in Jerusalem, but they didn't speak to each other for 2 years as the tensions between them mounted. Absalom knew that if he set the field of Joab on fire, then Joab could no longer avoid talking to him as well, which he had done up until that point. So that's what he did. He set the field on fire. So Absalom finally got to meet with his father, David, but this one meeting would not heal a wound that had festered for 5 years, even though after that meeting was over, David kissed Absalom, and they made up for the most part. Now, at this point, Absalom gathered himself, chariot, horses, and 50 men to run before him. Now, Absalom, by doing this, by gathering chariots and horses and men together, he took steps to enhance his position in the eyes of the people, the eyes of the public. Could we have a coup attempt on our hands? Possibly. You'll have to stay tuned to find out. Verses 13 and 14, basically we find David summoning his servants with him in Jerusalem and insisted that they all needed to flee at once because Absalom had built up this big army and he was coming. He was coming to Jerusalem, and David was like, oh, we got to get out of here. He's going to be tough. They're going to be tough. They're going to get us. They may kill us all. We don't know. So he got everybody, got to leave, got to get up, got to go. But he left 10 concubines behind. Now we'll read later on in 2 days, chapter 16, about why this was an important thing, those concubines staying behind. We get to verse 24. The Ark of the Covenant of God was probably brought. David brings the Ark of the Covenant back to Jerusalem. This was probably brought to ensure God's presence and as a mark of David's legitimate right to reign in case Absalom decided to overthrow David. Now Zadok and Abiathar stood by the king, who had endorsed their respective ministries and the ministries of the Levites. Now David created a spy network by doing this that included Zadok, Abiathar, and their sons. So Absalom would probably assume that David's supporters had all fled. He may not suspect Zadok and Abiathar of siding with his father if they went in there and stayed behind. So the idea was that they would all report back and David would know what's going on. But he got some bad news. The news that Ahithophel had joined the conspirators with Absalom, it was a pretty tough blow to David. And then we get to Hushai, who would end up being the answer to David's prayers here in just a minute. Hushai's role was to counteract Ahithophel's counsel. In other words, he was a counselor, and basically his word was almost as good as the word of God's. So that was kind of a blow. So people would find legitimacy in what he says about Absalom. So anyway, to counteract this, they were going to have to report everything to Zadok and Abiathar. Hamaz and Jonathan, the sons, would then relay any information they received from their fathers directly to David. Hushai and Absalom arrived in Jerusalem at the same time, the decisive moment when Absalom had to choose between Hushai's counsel and Ahithophel's counsel. And it's delayed by chapter 16, 1 through 14, and resumes at chapter 16, verse 15, as we'll find out the rest of the story in 2 days. I hope this has touched you. If it has, click the like button and the subscribe button. Of course, click the little jingle bell so you get notified the next time I upload a video, which is going to be tomorrow when we do our Psalms. The rest of the story in 2 days. We'll see you then too.